Jesus repeatedly addressed crowds while also watching who quietly removed themselves from them, and Scripture never treats that movement as accidental. Avoiding crowds feels like control, clarity, and emotional safety, yet the Bible documents it as an early signal of disengagement. What looks like self-regulation often masks withdrawal from shared accountability. This behavior was observed, recorded, and warned about long before it felt normal. Crowd avoidance has become a normalized response to modern pressure, framed as self-care, efficiency, or emotional intelligence. Yet Scripture quietly recorded this movement long before it had social approval. People step away from crowds because crowds demand synchronization, tolerance, compromise, and exposure, and modern systems exhaust those capacities faster than they replenish them. Noise, unpredictability, and emotional friction feel like threats to stability, so distance feels like control. This withdrawal rarely announces itself as fear or rejection. It presents as clarity, selectiveness, or peace. Proverbs noted that separation often follows personal desire rather than wisdom, and that observation aligns with what unfolds psychologically under sustained pressure. Avoiding crowds reduces immediate stress, but it also removes friction that once tested assumptions, corrected blind spots, and enforced shared reality. What feels like relief is actually a narrowing environment where beliefs go unchallenged and perceptions harden. Scripture tracks this narrowing as a precursor behavior, not an outcome, because the danger does not appear immediately. Jesus spoke to crowds while watching who stepped back from them, not because crowds were virtuous, but because isolation quietly rewires accountability. Modern culture praises the individual who opts out, yet Ecclesiastes warned that strength diminishes when connection thins, even if comfort increases. This behavior spreads because it works short-term, and systems reward short-term relief. The person feels safer, clearer, less burdened, and more in control. But Scripture never treats that state as stable. It treats it as transitional. The shift away from crowds is not the collapse itself, but it is the moment the supports stop touching. The danger is not what happens when people leave the crowd. It is what begins forming once no one is close enough to notice. This behavior does not originate in modern anxiety or digital overload. It repeats because the underlying pressure has always existed. Scripture documents communities where people slowly pulled away from shared spaces, shared burdens, and shared correction, believing separation would preserve clarity or righteousness. Language changes across centuries, but the movement stays the same. Irritation with noise becomes distrust of group motives, then a belief that distance equals discernment. What looks like preference is actually a recurring social pattern that surfaces whenever collective life becomes demanding. The Bible records this withdrawal not only during chaos, but during periods of structure and stability, when people feel they have earned the right to disengage. Historically, those who stepped back were not always rebels. Many believed they were being careful, refined, or above unnecessary involvement. That belief repeats now under different labels. Psychology calls it boundaries or overstimulation management, yet Scripture tracks the same arc without modern terminology. The pattern follows pressure and precedes fragmentation. Groups thin before they break. Accountability weakens before trust collapses. Jesus observed crowds because proximity exposes motive, and stepping away reduces exposure without resolving it. Ecclesiastes records that two withstand more than one, not as encouragement, but as observation of consequence when that bond dissolves. Scripture does not celebrate separation as wisdom by default. It records it as a fork in behavior, where comfort replaces correction. Over time, the person does not feel isolated, they feel justified. That justification hardens because no shared friction remains to challenge it. History shows this is how collective blindness begins, quietly and without alarm. The crowd does not notice the loss immediately. The individual feels relief, not warning. Scripture does not explain this behavior through emotion or personality. It records it as movement that produces consequence. When Proverbs notes that separation feeds personal desire, it marks a shift away from shared correction. Jesus withdrew at times, but Scripture distinguishes purposeful withdrawal from avoidance by timing and return. He stepped away and re-entered, while avoidant withdrawal often does not. Crowds surface resistance, fear, and misunderstanding in real time, exposing internal conflict isolation conceals. When people remove themselves from shared spaces, Scripture observes loss of mutual sharpening long before visible failure appears. Ecclesiastes documents that strength diminishes when one stands alone, even if the individual feels capable. Collapse is preceded by thinning connection, not rebellion. Communities drift before they fracture. Individuals disengage before they fall. The Bible treats crowds as pressure environments where motives are tested. Avoidance reduces testing without removing motive. Scripture notices who steps back to mark where accountability loosens. Jesus observed silence and withdrawal as signals, not sins. Separation changes what a person can see. When no one is close enough to challenge perception, perception replaces reality. The psychological consequence of crowd avoidance is not loneliness, it's distortion. Removing oneself from groups removes corrective signals that regulate perception, tone, and self-assessment. Ideas feel clearer than they are, emotions feel more justified, and narratives go untested. Comfort reinforces belief, and belief reinforces withdrawal. Scripture describes the state as deceptively calm. The person feels less irritated and less challenged, which modern psychology often misreads as healing, but the Bible shows this calm appears when friction disappears, not when health is restored. Without resistance, strength is never tested, discernment dulls, and confidence inflates quietly. Over time, disagreement feels like intrusion rather than information. The person does not feel disconnected, they feel refined. Scripture records that this refinement produces fragility, not resilience. As crowd avoidance stabilizes, the behavior stops feeling reactive and starts feeling earned. Distance becomes preference, then identity. Separation shifts from protection to control over exposure. The person chooses environments that confirm rather than challenge. Escalation occurs quietly. Internal narratives gain authority they were never meant to hold. Scripture records escalation presents as consistency, not danger. Everything feels quieter and manageable, but escalation does not need noise. It only needs distance to remain uninterrupted. Scripture marks the final warning signal not as collapse, rebellion, or visible failure, but invisibility. The person becomes absent by design, no longer placing themselves where seeing occurs. Disappearance ends correction without announcing intent. Internal logic becomes final authority. Scripture treats this state as exposed, not protected. Ecclesiastes records that when one falls alone, no one is near enough to register it. Crowds once acted as early detection systems. Their absence removes that system entirely. Nothing dramatic has happened yet. That is why it's dangerous. Scripture records collapse as ordinary continuation. The person feels consistent, not drifting. Beliefs stabilize without challenge. Warning no longer arrives through people. It arrives through consequence. Scripture leaves this pattern unresolved because what follows is never instructional. Once the crowd is fully absent, the next phase does not ask permission. And by the time the consequence appears, the distance can no longer be undone.